Okay, I think we'll get started. Thank you all for coming to this on a beautiful day in wherever you are around the world. Glad to have an opportunity to talk about Chinese influence in Hollywood, questions of censorship, questions of how do we accurately or creatively portray China in the face of the growing influence of the Chinese Communist Party, both domestically and globally. And to tackle these issues, excited to have three excellent panelists, James Tager, Chris Fenton, and Megha Rajgopalan. James is at PEN America and just did an excellent report on issues of China and censorship and Hollywood. Chris Fenton wrote perhaps the first tell-all book about how this sausage is made, how exactly Beijing is playing in Hollywood. And as he pointed out, conversation we had before, also talks about some of the things that we want to do about it to make the system work better. And Megha is a fantastic journalist who has written a lot about issues of freedom of expression, issues involving Xinjiang, the region in northwest China, where there are roughly 1 million Muslims and other people in concentration camps, and also had some fun run-ins with Chinese Communist Party security state as well, which I'll let her talk about if she so chooses. So because this is looking at issues of censorship, specifically in Hollywood, Chris, why don't we start with you? And when you're having a conversation with someone who, say a family member or someone who's sort of outside the space and they want to understand how does censorship in Hollywood work when it comes to China? How do you explain that to them?
Well, it's interesting because there's different layers of it, and it probably goes back to 1997, like a lot of us have talked about, and the PEN America report actually reported on really well, when we had a handful of movies like 7 Years in Tibet, et cetera, that were made without thinking about how the CCP or China would react to them. And ultimately, we found out that they reacted very poorly to them and actually put the studios behind those movies on sort of a probationary period at a time when the movie theater sort of system, the market was really, really small. So it didn't really matter at the time in 1997 on a financial basis, but what it did do was wake up Hollywood to the fact that if they want to participate in what was going to be a massive theatrical market, they would have to think about premeditatively censoring the kinds of stories that they tell, even if they expected it not to play in China, because China was keeping a close eye on those type of movies. So if you look at the type of censorship that goes on with the studios, you have premeditated censorship, which is simply the the R&D part of making movies, whether it's buying a pitch, buying a script that handles very sensitive topics to China, simply not moving forward on that, or perhaps something in their vault that they were developing that suddenly they realize is sensitive to China, they just simply stop further development of. Then there's the actual edits that occur with a finished movie, which is done in regards to the certain sort of criteria or the things that are off limits in China, with a movie that's already made, but the studio wants to get in there. So they'll edit out things that might be overly sexual, they might have drug use in it, they might say the word Tibet or Taiwan in it. Maybe it showcases a Chinese person as a villain or in some sort of demeaning kind of way. So there's that post-production editing censorship process. And then there's also the sort of premeditated building of a story that plays into the CCP narrative in order to get the wind to your back in that market from the government. So in particular, Looper is one that we can talk about later, where we actually designed that movie to placate and actually really please the CCP in order to monetize the movie is at its potential maximum. And then finally, the other form of censorship, which is the one we really need to address first in this massive problem that we have with China, is the cross-border censorship of particular product and content that we make in Hollywood. And an example of that is the latest Top Gun movie, where the Taiwanese and Japanese flag were removed in order to make the movie viewable in China. Yet also China said, no, 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 you got to remove that for the rest of the world to see too. And that's a real problem. It's one thing to censor something for their market, to monetize the market. But when they're telling us we need to censor it for the rest of the world because they want to control the narrative of what that movie is saying, that is where we have to draw the line.
Okay, thank you, Chris. James, question to you. How do you understand and describe the censorship aspects of Beijing's influence on Hollywood?
Yeah, well, I start with the elevator pitch for the why Beijing is able to successfully kind of impose or strongly suggest, quote unquote, these conditions on Hollywood is very simple. China's box office is imminently poised to become the most significant box office in the world. So there are massive economic imperatives for Hollywood studios to play ball. In terms of how this plays out, I mean, there's several things to consider, but one point that I always like to discuss is I think the average person, when they conceive of censorship, is they conceive of one very specific list of enumerated topics or content choices that you're not allowed to have, and they assume that you go to that list, and if you're off the list, then everything's fine. And that's certainly not the way that the Chinese censorship system plays out. It's a lot more dynamic, flexible, and based on sort of a negotiated process between the studios and government censors with a lot of intermediaries. So, studios will essentially try to, as Chris was saying, preempt and anticipate potential objections by the censors and try to address them beforehand as much as possible. So those will be conversations with cultural consultants or, it can be Chinese financiers, or it can be others who sort of have a back-end access to what the Chinese censors are thinking. One of the benefits of this is it doesn't really create much of a paper trail. It's hard to document. And a secondary benefit of this is no one knows exactly where the lines are actually drawn. And when you, as a Hollywood decision maker, don't know where the lines are actually drawn, your impetus is to be even more conservative in terms of where you draw the lines, and you'll take a maximalist position in order to be. We had this one interview where I think it was Stanley Rosen, a professor at USC, who said that Hollywood studios are becoming increasingly savvy and increasingly paranoid. So more and more, the concern is that they're going out of their way to remove anything that is even kind of potentially objectionable before it actually even reaches the censor's desk. So there is this formalized process by which the censor will review things, but we're seeing basically the timeline of censorship and self-censorship get pushed back earlier and earlier in the movie production process. And that makes it harder to quantify and also sort of more insidious in terms of how it will manifest itself.
Fantastic. Thank you. So Megan and I both lived in Beijing as journalists. And I remember one question I always used to get from Americans was, okay, so how do you get censored from reporting in China? And so how do you understand that? How do you answer that question when people ask you that, either when you were living there or now when you write about China?
It's a really good question. And I think the answer is complicated because unlike like a film studio, we don't have the obligation to work and negotiate with the Chinese government prior to everything that we publish. And that's true for print and broadcast. Essentially, we as journalists will have a particular visa and a particular accreditation to be able to work in China. But we're not in the process of negotiating with government authorities prior to publication every single time. But that doesn't mean that there's no blowback. So if you publish something that's critical of the government, for instance, it's not uncommon to get a phone call from a government official saying, why did you publish this, that sort of thing. It's not necessarily different from other countries. But I think where it gets more insidious is sort of what James was referring to, is this kind of phenomenon of self-censorship, which happens often because there's a foreign publication, a US or European publication, for instance, that has some kind of financial interest in China, which enables the government to use that link to put pressure on the news coverage, which is supposed to be independent. So I guess the most famous example of this is, many years ago when Bloomberg published an expose on the illicit wealth of China's leadership. After that, there was a kind of minor scandal where they were essentially caught censoring future coverage that was going to be critical because the Chinese government had put pressure on them via state-owned banks, and essentially told state-owned banks, like, don't buy Bloomberg terminals anymore. And this is something that has happened to probably a number of publications. I think Isaac and I were both part of this group called the Foreign Correspondents Club, and we did an annual survey every year about issues like this, and a lot of people would say that their publications had felt this kind of pressure. So I think it's interesting because it also, even though it's very different from the film industry, it's the exact same dynamic where the censorship system and this kind of moving line of what is acceptable and what is not kind of encourages and creates this climate of self-censorship. It creates all of the incentives, the business incentives for self-censorship to happen. And I actually think they've been remarkably successful at that.
I agree. I definitely agree. So when I was living in China, the question I'd get from Chinese people about these issues is, okay, so what percentage of your stories are positive about China and what percent are negative? And Xi Jinping for the last several years has had this big push about telling China's story well. And can you talk about the difference? We'll start with you, Mega, in reporting, and then we'll get into film, but the difference between speaking accurately about China and censoring negative information about China.
Sure. So I think that, when it comes to positive and negative news, there are some kind of like, I don't want to call them cultural factors because it's really more about a political culture than culture in the sense that we would ordinarily think about it. But there's an idea in Chinese political culture about the role of the media, which is very distinct from kind of the accountability role of the fourth estate that we would normally talk about in the US. The idea is that the role of the media is supposed to sort of constructively improve society, which sounds really good, but until you realize that it has to be done sort of within the confines of the current government, which is of course an autocratic government, right? So I think this notion of good stories and bad stories sort of comes out of that. The idea that you would write something positive appears to be kind of constructive. It's building up the country. It's saying something good about them. But where something negative can be sort of tearing something down, right? But I think commonly, like the way that journalists understand accountability is that when you're highlighting something negative, it's because something bad has happened and you want to change it. It's something like corruption, for instance. Without it coming to public light, there is no way for it to be checked. And I think that that's sort of what is kind of missing from the discussion in China about the kind of the role and function of journalism. And I think often that is sort of where those questions come from. It's also, there's sort of a double thing happening here because I think criticism is considered to be even more problematic when it comes from outsiders, because then it's somebody who's coming from outside of China. They're coming here and living here. They're criticizing people. It's sort of seen as like as a bit of an insult, I think. And I think that again comes out of the situation where the media in China itself is like heavily censored. It's sort of restricted. Journalists in China are restricted very heavily from criticizing just many aspects of social and political life, ranging from environmental degradation and health, as we found out very painfully during the pandemic, all the way to things like human rights, Tibet, Taiwanese independence, and that sort of thing. So that's kind of where I think those things come from.
Great. And then Chris, in Hollywood, how would people think about the difference between accurately portraying China and positively portraying China? Or was there not a sense of the difference between those two things?
Well, it's interesting hearing Mega talk about it, and you also, because I never really come at it from the journalist standpoint or the news standpoint. But the fact of the matter is, they're all overseen, whether it's movies or radio or television or journalistic endeavors. They're all overseen. At one time, it was a bureaucratic organization called the State Administration of Radio, Film, and Television, but that got eliminated, and now it goes straight to the party's entity, which is essentially called the Ministry of Propaganda, or the Propaganda Ministry, or some version of that, right? So if you look at the way they look at journalism, or they look at a movie, or they look at a television series, it's essentially the same. It's all just some form of propaganda in their view. So I like to sort of simplify it and say, well, how do they look at that form of propaganda, and why? And what their agenda is simply they have 1.4 billion people there, right? And their role as running that country, which I would say is the 7 standing committee members, and then of course Xi, is to keep those 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't revolt. And I say just happy enough because there's just simply not enough resources on earth to make them all happy. So part of what they have to do is provide everything that they need and some of what they want. But then the messaging has to be there for all the people that can't get everything that they want, which is a very small subset of that country. And even if you bring it into the middle class, that's only 600 million. So you got another 800 million there that don't really have a lot of what they want. So the messaging has to be that someday they'll get there, or someday their aspirations to get there will be met, right? So everything that we do filmmaker wise to journalism has to essentially play into that narrative. Otherwise they have another June 4, 1989, which is what they want to avoid.
James, how do you see the difference between accuracy and propaganda, and how do you think Hollywood can or does deal with, on the one hand, having a longstanding discrimination against Asian Americans and Black Americans and a lot of people, and how do you increase Chinese participation, Chinese American, Asian American participation in film, while at the same time not creating films that are beholden to Beijing and censoring for China?
Thank you, Isaac. That's the exact version of the question I wanted to answer. And if you hadn't asked it that way, I would have just answered it that way anyway, because I think it's crucially important, this issue, which is that the issue of anticipatory self-censorship and censorship of Hollywood studios in response to the Chinese government is increasingly coming to the fore at the exact same time that there's an increasing sort of correct and laudatory expectation on Hollywood to sort of do better in telling international stories, diverse stories, by which I mean, showing people, breaking free of a white or American-centric narrative. Something that keeps on popping up when people speak about this issue is they say, there are no more Chinese villains. And that's an example of Chinese governmental influence. And that is correct. But we should follow the thought and make it clear, like, what we're recommending when we're talking about Chinese governmental censorship is not, and that's why we should go back to having a bunch of Chinese villains. That's not what we're saying, right? The issue is not that we no longer have Chinese villains. The issue is that that is a significant creative choice that has been made in response to the perceived dictates of a government censor. So that can be a bit of a tricky, a tricky needle to thread. The need for increasing representation of Asians and Asian Americans as one major example of our need for more diverse and international stories, while at the same time making sure that those stories are not controlled or deeply influenced by a government, a censorious government at that. Mulan, I think, is actually a kind of a useful example. Perhaps we were going to get to this earlier, but I'm shamelessly jumping the gun. One of perhaps the big controversy about Mulan was how they thanked a couple of Xinjiang located government agencies that are actively involved in either perpetrating or kind of propagandizing human rights abuses. And the interesting thing about Mulan is that was a film that had a bunch of Chinese cultural consultants that presumably were there to make sure that the film, was sensitive to Chinese cultural dictates. And yet either none of them decided to mention to the filmmakers that, hey, you shouldn't film in a place where there's active crimes against humanity ongoing, or it was mentioned and disregarded. If it was not mentioned, it really illustrates the priorities of Hollywood studios when they're looking for, cultural conversation or for advice from cultural commentators. The idea being we're conflating what we think, the Chinese people and Chinese Americans and Chinese tourist support groups around the globe would like to see in their movies with what the Chinese government would like to see in their movies. And conflating a people and a government is always deeply, deeply problematic. So we'll talk more about answers, but certainly the answer is not, and let's cast more Chinese villains, but it's about how can we be respectful and thoughtful towards the Chinese cultural context, which is really a different version of the word accuracy. It's a sort of cultural sensitivity as opposed to a fact-based accuracy. But how can we be sensitive to that while at the same time acknowledging that right now the gatekeeper to the Chinese market is the government censor, and disambiguating that is really important.
I think that's a great point, and making it very clear to people that there is a huge difference between China and the Chinese Communist Party, which currently rules China, but isn't the same thing as China. And when we conflate the two of them, we are playing into the party's hands, because the party wants people to think, both inside in China and out, that there's no sunlight between what the party wants and what China wants and what their needs are.
100%.
And by the way, I might interject that I think it was you, Isaac, that broke that story, right? With the Mulan card in there, or you were one of the first?
I wrote something about that. It was just shocking to see, like James was saying, it's hard to know how this happened, but it was shocking to see Disney thank propaganda departments in Xinjiang with, ongoing crimes against humanity. It felt surreal to watch that actually happen, because it feels like a lot of Hollywood studios and a lot of American companies are still seeing China circa 2010, where, big developing market, yes, some human rights problems, but this is going in the right direction, and not realizing that both China and the American public have moved on from that view. And speaking of that, Chris, so you wrote this really explosive book, and I'd love to hear the reactions from some of the people in Hollywood who are, say, more pro-Beijing, more comfortable engagement with China. How have they reacted to you and to the book?
Well, number one is, I don't know if there's anybody particularly pro-Beijing, and I don't really see anybody as like an evil villain in Hollywood by any stretch. And the book is really, I handled the topic relatively with sensitivity, because what I wanted to do is not make some scandalous, salacious, here's what happens on, behind closed doors, but essentially walk people through how we got to this point in history, and perhaps lay the groundwork of what we can do to fix it. And then, of course, cover it with some really entertaining anecdotes in the middle of it to make it a fun read. But to answer your question, for the most part, I've gotten a lot of support, but it's been all private. No one's willing to really come out. In fact, it was nice to see Judd Apatow start talking about it, which I thought was fantastic. I don't know if his movies have been in that market, mainly because comedy doesn't really translate well into those Asian markets. But it was nice to see him talking about it, and he's been very vocal. And we're seeing, we saw an NBA player the other day, and we're starting to see a little bit of a groundswell. Because to me, it's not like James says, it's not about, let's go make more movies with Chinese villains, right? China is an amazing market that we help build. In fact, I'm complicit as a cog in the wheel in helping them understand the process of movie making, getting their below the line crews up to speed with sort of the world-class below the line crews we had here. And there were a lot of skill set exchanges we did over the years. And quite frankly, now we're seeing the results of that, which is a market that's almost fully independent from Hollywood now, which is a real problem. So I feel not great about that. But the fact is if we want to monetize that market, we need to think like Universal did with Fast and the Furious, which is, hey, car culture big in the Latino community. Let's cast one of the characters with Michelle Rodriguez, right? Very smart commercial move. And that's something that I think we look at some of the plays that Hollywood makes with the movies. Some of them are just great business moves as far as monetizing that market at its full potential. Where we need to fight back, the part that we need to address is this encroachment across borders. So number one is we brought up the Top Gun situation. Quite frankly, it's our right in this country to say what we want to say, whether it's critical of China or not. And we should be able to do it without retaliation from that market. They have that right in that market to say whatever they want to say about the USA, right? And we do not, as a government, shut down their businesses, their products and services from access to this market because they're critical of what we do. So we need reciprocity there. And the ability to win back that reciprocity and get back our freedom of speech rights, to me, is the most important part. Like, to allow Daryl Morey to say what he said on Houston, Texas soil without retaliation against the NBA needs to be part of it. And that is a big issue, because the freedom of speech is one of the most vital values and principles that we hold dearly as Americans, and we've lost it. And I think with Disney and the Milan situation, yes, we had bipartisan Senate and House members yelling at Disney. We had the public yelling at Disney. We had everybody yelling at Disney. And we didn't want them. They made a mistake, right? And they put that card in there. And it was probably very innocent and naive and maybe stupid of them to do that. But there are certain reasons they did, I know, because we've credited certain organizations in China in the years too. But what we're asking them to do is not fix the problem in Xinjiang. We're not telling them, you need to go get rid of those concentration camps and rid the problem from the earth. We're asking them to be American and to stand up and say, we apologize. That was a stupid oversight. And we do not condone what is happening to Uyghurs over there. That is atrocious, and we do not support it. And we are fully against it as Americans. That's all we want them to do. And what we want China to do is to reciprocate that potential of saying what's on our mind without retaliation from that market. And if you look at what's in their best interest, it is in their best interest. What happened was a tempest in a teapot. You know, Isaac and some other great journalists came up with what that problem was. And all Disney had to do was apologize and say that was wrong, and we don't condone what's going on over there, and it would have deflated the problem. But instead, Congress got involved, the Senate, critics, journalists, then the firewall of China couldn't contain it, and it got into their, you know, the ether of what people were talking about there. And suddenly it created this nightmare face-losing episode for both sides of the Pacific. Right. And it could have been avoided by simply allowing us to deflate pressure and voice what we want to say here, and just firewall it from their populace, for heaven's sakes. They don't have to let anybody see that. But instead, everybody saw it, and it became a much bigger issue than it should have.
Yes, yes. And in a minute, I want us to discuss ways that we can bring the Xinjiang story to Hollywood, or how that process can change. But Megha, first, I want to hear more about your experiences and how, if at all, people treated you differently after getting de facto booted from China.
After getting booted from China, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I will talk about that, but I wanted to actually add a little bit to Chris's point about Top Gun. You know, we're talking about inclusivity here, and I guess the kind of growing tide of inclusivity towards Asian Americans in Hollywood, like, to me as an Asian American, is extremely positive. Even as someone who doesn't work in the industry, I think it's absolutely laudable. But if you're talking about something like this Top Gun example is just the perfect one, because the ask there is removing the Taiwanese flag from a film that already exists. There are 900,000 Taiwanese Americans who would probably love to be part of this inclusivity mission, right? This is not about inclusivity. It's about the kind of political will of one particular nation state. It happens to be a huge market. And I think it's really important that those two things not be conflated, because there are some areas where both of those goals could align, but there are many areas where they simply don't. And I think the erasure of minority populations and within China and of course of Taiwan is a really good example of that. As far as the whole getting thrown out of China thing, yeah, I mean, it's tough to say, but I think that I've shifted a lot of my work to being able to do it about China, but from outside of China, by using resources like satellite imagery to document the growth of the camps in Xinjiang, by talking to kind of people like dissidents who have fled overseas and stuff like that. So I think in large part, it hasn't had as deep of an impact on my work as I maybe thought that it would. But I think just on the subject of what we're discussing in terms of like China's reach overseas, I think I've definitely witnessed the impacts of this kind of censoriousness on people overseas because of pressure that is being put on people's families who are speaking out in public in ways that are critical of the Chinese government. You know, there's a really famous example of this woman named Anastasia Lin, who is she's a model and a beauty queen. She was crowned Miss Canada, I think, and she was actually barred from going to the pageant, which that year was hosted in Eastern China, because she is a vocal critic of the Chinese government, and she also belongs to Falun Gong, which is a religion that is banned in China. So this is just this is an example of this, right? Because she's first and foremost an entertainer. She's also an activist, but she was there in her capacity as a beauty pageant contestant, you know, not as an activist. But it shows like how much the Chinese government has the power to impact our speech, even when we're abroad. And in that case, she was, of course, Canadian Chinese. She was not of Chinese nationality.
Thank you, Megha. So we are going to open it up to questions. Please do start sending in your questions. While we're getting some questions in, James, do you want to talk about what you think people outside of Hollywood can do to pressure in any small, subtle ways changes in portrayals of China and the silence on Xinjiang?
Yeah, I mean, so when it comes to changes in portrayals of China, I mean, one of the beautiful things about this event that we are in right now is, I mean, yesterday was the screening of 76 Days, right, which was Hawu. So, you know, one of the recommendations we make in our report on the subject, which is available for free, www.pen.org, shameless plug, nailed it, is that, you know, encouraging more sort of dissident, independent, and exiled Chinese filmmakers, right? I mean, if we want to challenge the idea that the Chinese government gets sort of carte blanche to say what any story of or relating to China will be, then one of the ways that we can do that as individuals is to watch those films that are not part of that sort of body of work that could be influenced by Chinese censors. So I think that's an important starting point. You know, I'll transition really quickly to when it comes to the recommendations that we at PEN America made. You know, we call for transparency. We actually think there should be basically a reporting mechanism by which Hollywood studios disclose the censorship requests that they receive. And we said from any government, you know, don't make it a government specific thing, from any government. Now, this is kind of tricky, and there have been some thoughtful critiques of this because it is hard to figure out how to make this more public and transparent while not simply pushing Hollywood decision makers to make those decisions earlier in the process so that there's less and less of a paper trail. But we continue to believe that sunlight is the best disinfectant. So, and hopefully this is something that individual attendees listening can take with them. The idea that we need public discussion of this in order to galvanize a unified industry response. And to this day, it feels like the prevailing attitude from the industry is just hoping this goes away, right? Like, let's, you know, hopefully whenever a story breaks, just write it out. Hopefully no more stories will break. Let's have these conversations behind closed doors. Let's just kind of hope this issue goes away. And it won't. In fact, the trends indicate that it'll become more and more of an issue as the Chinese box office grows, as China's domestic film industry basically, you know, theater goes in China kind of need Hollywood less and less for those big budget spectacles. But Hollywood studios increasingly need access to the Chinese market. The trend towards the pressure that the Chinese government is able to bring to the fore will only grow. So if we aren't having this conversation now, it becomes more difficult to have the conversation later in a way that is actually actionable.
By the way, I would just add that it's even if the conversation
Chris,
goes away.
Oh, okay, you're back. Sorry.
Yeah, even if it goes away from the Hollywood conversation, right? It's going to be out there when it comes to NBA or Nike or Activision or Marriott hotels or different airlines that are taking Taiwan out of their map, right? Like, it's gonna be out there. It's a freedom of speech censorship issue that is now global. It's beyond the China borders. So whether it's Hollywood that's in the crosshairs or something else, this is an issue that's gonna have to be tackled.
So on to tackling that issue, Chris. So you mentioned Judd Apatow. Christian Bale in 2011, I think, did an incredibly brave journey to the village that Chung Guangcheng, blind dissident, was being held at the time. How do people outside of Hollywood encourage people in Hollywood to stand up and say something about China or Xinjiang?
Well, I think, and I don't want to conflate it with politics or race issues, but I think what you might see is like the NBA, for instance, which you could argue there's lots of reasons that the ratings are down for the playoffs, but one of the many could be the fact that they're very hypocritical about human rights issues going on in China, and they're staying with their head in the sand, and consumers are feeling that hypocrisy is something that is tuning them out to wanting to tune into those basketball games. If I'm correct in that, where like a fraction of those people are exactly what I'm describing, I think we're going to see the same thing happen with Hollywood, right? And that is going to compound or amplify just the vocalism that the public is starting to have towards this hypocrisy. I mean, keep in mind, Hollywood is sort of the pillar, the vehicle of freedom of speech and individual creative expression, right? If it's stifled and the public catches that conduit, that vehicle, that iconic sort of part of our society that makes us America, the consumer and the public is going to get very upset. And then that's when you start to see Congress get involved. I would imagine we're going to start seeing hearings about it on Capitol Hill, where C-suites are brought back to talk about this issue. And that will keep it, as James says, from staying a third rail issue. But then the part that's going to really get it to the next level is if we start to see consumers stop going to movies because of that political issue, because of that value issue. And I don't think we've seen it yet, although I could argue that when we see the actual Milan numbers, we might start to be able to predict that some of that is happening. But when that happens, then the cat's out of the bag and it's going to have to get addressed. And I am pushing to get proactive. Like, the last thing Hollywood needs is yet another obstacle to creating revenues. I mean, we are in a massive disruptive environment right now. We don't need another disruption. So let's get in front of this thing. Let's start addressing it before C-suite gets pulled to Capitol Hill and the grandstanding occurs and the public gets even more upset about it. And it starts damaging the revenues of the movies here in America.
Mega, I wanted to talk to you specifically about Xinjiang and the Xinjiang story. So you've done a lot of really excellent reporting on that. And a frustration that myself and others feel and express is that it just doesn't seem to be getting that much attention. And maybe because it's mostly about Muslims, and maybe because it's a region that's difficult to pronounce. But why do you see this not getting the kind of attention that I assume that you feel like it deserves?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons, including the two that you just mentioned. It's not a trivial thing that the word Uyghur is hard for Americans to pronounce, for English speakers. I think, yeah, it's a tough one, but I think, this is a panel about Hollywood. And I think a part of the answer to this is that there are no like famous champions of this issue. Like, how many Americans learned about Tibet and the Dalai Lama because of Richard Gere? A lot. Like, my parents probably learned about the Tibet issue from Richard Gere, and I've always wondered, like, why aren't more people championing this cause? I mean, you can find celebrities talking about all kinds of issues, like ranging from malnutrition to treatment of Palestinians. Like, what is it about this issue that hasn't sort of broken through yet? I guess part of the answer is it possibly actually hasn't been enough time. The kind of current crackdown started only in probably late 2016, early 2017. So if you really think about it, we've only had kind of 3 to 4 years. And for the majority of that time, people weren't really following the issue that closely. I think it's only in the past couple of years that it's really sort of started to break through, I think. On the consumer side of it, for Americans, I was researching a story that I never ended up writing. But what I found out was essentially there was a couple of U.S. clothing brands, U.S. and European clothing brands that were they were essentially like making some of their clothes in Xinjiang, and this was sort of a known thing, and like it had been reported and stuff like that. And I spoke to this group of Muslim American women. They were like young women in their 20s, and they had seen this, and they went on these clothing brands Instagram sites, and they started commenting like, you know, like, stop doing this, like you are enabling a genocide. And the clothing retailers deleted the comments. And I thought this was remarkable because it's just like the worst PR decision ever. And then, of course, when I asked about it for like me as a journalist, they were like, oh, it was a complete mistake and stuff like that. But I guess the lesson that I took away from that is that this was a very kind of like small scale thing. This was just sort of a group of friends that had decided to do this. But, you know, in fact, their small action did inspire this brand to do something else, which is, you know, change their behavior in some way. It showed that this brand was sort of spooked by this association with, you know, something that a lot of people would call a genocide, right? And I do think that that shows the kind of power of consumer pressure in our current environment where things just blow up really quickly on social media, where you don't necessarily have to have consumer pressure at scale to impact a certain company or a certain product, particularly entertainment products like films. That we've seen to be heavily impacted by things like, you know, the presence of racism, people doing, you know, pretending to be racist that they're not, and the sort of stuff like that. And I think that that sort of gives me hope that if there was sort of a greater level of like kind of public advocacy from, you know, people with sort of large followings or celebrities and stuff like that, then this issue would probably break through to more Americans than it has done already.
James, let's talk about another thing that's happening right now, which, you know, unfortunately we can't escape, which is the coronavirus pandemic. What effect would you say that has had on Beijing's influence in Hollywood and China Hollywood censorship issues?
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, again, this is a group of attendees that are perhaps uniquely poised to think about this, because with 76 Days, which was the showing, I believe yesterday, you know, one of the filmmakers there was anonymous, right? Demonstrating that like they felt that in order to tell a true story about the origins, you know, and the government response to the coronavirus pandemic, that they would need to kind of hide their identity. Contrast that with an example that we've pointed to quite a bit, which is the movie World War Z, which was Paramount Pictures. Brad Pitt shoots a bunch of zombies in the head. But that was a movie based on a book, World War Z, written by Max Brooks. And in the beginning of the pandemic, actually, Max Brooks has talked about publicly how he set the origin of his fictional virus in China. In part as a commentary on China's system of censorship, and saying, well, you know, when you have systemic censorship, there are public health effects because people are less likely to put out negative information regarding, you know, potential health pandemics out into the world, and it's more likely to be censored, and that will kind of promote the spread without any kind of unified government reaction. Now, the studios, when making the movie adaptation, Paramount actually had that removed. Any mention of the fictional virus as originating in China was removed. And I saw this, I didn't come up with this line, and I'm very jealous, but it was some reporter who said, zombies can't come from China, was the conclusion, right? So if that is the lack of willingness, if that is emblematic of the lack of willingness that a Hollywood studio might have to tell a fictional story about a fictional virus originating in China, what confidence should we have in Hollywood's ability to tell a story about an actual virus originating in China and the government response therein? And when we're talking about the government response to a virus, that is something that's a massive story that has to do with our health, that has to do with the globe's health, right? So it really is indicative of the power and importance that Hollywood has as a storytelling center. I mean, we talk about Hollywood is arguably the world's most preeminent teller of stories, and not just for America, not just for China, for the world, right? The stories that Hollywood puts out it's consumed by audiences around the world. And you don't even really need to think of the idea that, Hollywood will not make a movie about Xinjiang internment camps. Gee, who would see that movie anyway? But maybe it stops them from making, from having a fictional internment camp in a sci-fi classic, because they're worried that there will be parallels that could be drawn to Xinjiang internment camps and that'll be blocked by China, right? When we step out that way, we see that anything that is kind of great sensitivity to the Chinese Communist Party could have really significant ramifications for what stories we tell down the line. And it doesn't have to be on the nose, like, oh, okay, as long as we don't do anything about Xinjiang, it will be fine. But these thematic issues are just as likely to be censored by the Chinese government, and thus affected when Hollywood is figuring out what stories to tell.
James, I certainly share your pessimism with these issues. Chris, you talked before about Hollywood studios and the C-suite getting out ahead of further criticism for Hollywood's missteps or crimes. Are you optimistic that that's going to happen?
Well, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I didn't think I could be a cog in the wheel and affect change here. I mean, there is, even though my relationships, and I think I'm sensitive about calling things out because I have potential solutions that I think are baby steps towards a farther North Star that's harder to get to. I put business on hold to do this, and I wouldn't have done it if I don't think I could make a difference. So I will be rainbow and unicorn and think that there is a way to address this and fix it. I mean, when America actually wants to do something and is united against a certain challenge or for a certain challenge, we usually do overcome it. This is a red and blue issue. This is very nonpartisan, or it's very bipartisan. It is something that we need to look at as a country and ask ourselves, how do we want to do this? And I think we have a ticking clock here where we have, I mean, there's a great Jed Rothstein documentary called The China Hustle, which shows sort of the corruption of our capitalistic system that's occurred from China. I think it's obvious that our patriotic sort of values and beliefs have been very corrupted too, and we have allowed our freedom of speech rights to just simply vanish. And if we continue down this path, we're going to get to a point where it's too late. And I do see, to use the Hollywood term, a ticking clock here, and we have to address it. I do think the only way C-suites are going to get their head out of the sand, and I think we came close on Mulan. Like, we saw the C-suite at Disney actually slightly respond to it with the CFO. We also saw the president of production respond to it to an MP in the UK the other day. And I think that might have been supposed to be a private conversation, but it turned out to go public. So the old way of like hoping the news cycle disappears, I think, was suddenly realized, well, maybe it won't. I do think there's a belief that the election coming up is going to allow ostrich heads in the sand again, depending on who wins. I'd like to believe that no matter who wins, and I don't have a horse in that race on publicly, I'm just saying, like, whoever wins that, I would like to hope that we continue to keep the pressure on to address this. And it's really going to be about keeping it away from becoming a third rail issue again, keeping the pressure on publicly with C-suites, having Congress continue to stay involved, and have consumers, boycott with their own pocketbooks potentially in order to get this properly addressed. And I do think, if you look at it, let's go to the NBA again, the way the NBA dealt with a domestic issue, where they boycotted a handful of games and the rest of the sports community came together in solidarity for that movement. we could do the same thing with China. Like, not about, hey, shut down the camps in Xinjiang, but rather let's work on something baby step here. Like, let's get our first amendment, you know, your freedom of speech, First Amendment rights back. And if you shut down Paramount in that market because we're not allowed to have the Taiwanese flag on the jacket for people in Peoria, Illinois to see, we as a Hollywood community are not going to send our movies over there. IMAX is going to shut its theaters over there. Like, Activision will stop selling games over there. Whatever it is, like, we need to come together. And that kind of an effort will create an issue where, like we talked about before, the CCP will go, well, wait, this should be a tempest in a teapot. And now we're conflating it into something big that's becoming face losing. Let's contain it. Let's give them back what they had, and let's back off. Because we see them retreat quite often. I mean, we can talk about wolf warrior diplomacy, which I feel like that whole initiative by the foreign ministry has sort of disappeared over the last couple months because various countries, not really together, but just sort of simultaneously happened to push back on that effort. So we do see them retreat. They are practical. So anyway, I'm hopeful.
We have about 10 minutes left. I just got a note that 76 Days has been picked up by MTV Documentaries, which is great. I wanted to jump on what you were saying about the election. And I would like to say, though, that Hollywood is overwhelmingly blue. And one worry that I have is that Hollywood would be a lot more influential in DC under a Biden administration, and that could cause some backsliding with some of the issues that we're discussing. And Mega, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that from a political perspective. Do you have any idea of how a Biden administration would handle these issues compared to Trump administration?
You know, I think to answer that question well, I would have to know a lot more than I do about the kind of lobbying power of the film industry. And that's just something that I haven't necessarily looked at. As a broader point about how would the Biden administration approach China versus the Trump administration, honestly, they haven't said a lot about it. I think one thing that they have done particularly on the Xinjiang issues, that they've labeled it a genocide, which is, you know, that's a pretty strong statement from them, particularly considering that genocide has like a definition under international law, and there are sort of consequences to doing that. I think the Trump administration is an interesting one because you see a lot of vacillation. Like, people have already forgotten that in the first years of this administration, you know, Trump invited Xi Jinping to Florida and, you know, treated him like a friend. And we've gone from that to now China being public enemy number one, and you know, all kinds of measures being rolled out in an effort to target China. So I think what that tells you is that even if Trump is reelected, we shouldn't really expect consistency in the U.S.-China policy that exists this year. We don't necessarily shouldn't necessarily expect that to become the policy of the administration that will last for the next 4 years. It could very well fluctuate again, along with other political priorities. And I think that probably that's true to an extent for a Democratic administration as well. Obviously, when Biden worked in the Obama administration, you know, he was not known for espousing the policies of that day, which would have been the kind of tough on China policies, like notably around China's island building in the South China Sea, around particular human rights issues. A lot of that was in service of a larger goal that administration had around signing a deal involving climate change mitigation with China. So I think it's a tough one because if you look at it through one lens, there's a kind of bipartisan consensus around China, like kind of some of the more problematic things that China is doing in the world. And I certainly think censorship and censorship that impacts Americans is probably chief among those, just because, like, as Chris has pointed out, it's really crossing a line, I think, with our political culture in the US. But I think when it comes to diplomacy, like there are so many competing priorities. The US and China is definitely the most important economic relationship in the world. And I would expect that in either case, whoever wins, that the level with which they prioritize these concerns like free speech and human rights more broadly will probably fluctuate along with like other goals that are considered sort of more pragmatic, like things like trade and other things that both of these governments want to get done.
Great, great. So about 5 minutes left. James, I'd love to hear from you, and I'll ask the other two panelists. What can people do about this? What if you're, say, a student or a young professional and you're frustrated with issues of freedom of expression in Hollywood, what do you recommend?
First recommendation, read our report. Nailed it, crushing it right now. Everyone's gonna read the report. I'm so excited. Again, I would really start with, watch, talk about, think about stories that are being told on these issues from independent from independent filmmakers or filmmakers who are able to kind of tell these stories free from these constraints. And I think that How Was 76 Days is a great example. Obviously, pay attention because this is an issue that kind of pops up iteratively. It's so strange because it's largely invisible, this issue, until it isn't, right? I mean, we're coming along, then Mulan happens, and then it kind of dies back down again, and you have the next experience, and it dies back down again. So definitely, keep this in mind even when it's not making the news, I would say. But certainly, I mean, the question of what any individual can do is part of the problem, because it's very difficult for the average individual to be super active on this. I think they should be raising their voices on these issues when they see that films have been influenced in a way they're not aware of, and converse with people around the world about their movie watching experience. I mean, one of the things that's interesting about this issue is I think the average American doesn't reflect at all on the fact that people in other countries may be watching a different version of the film from the one they've watched. Or, of course, what we've been talking about today, the bigger issue of the idea that the film that they have watched has been influenced by a foreign government. But I certainly think watching it, being active on it, commenting on it, not only when China does it, but any government's attempts to kind of impose these types of censorships. I mean, to piggyback on a couple things that were just said in relating to, how the Trump approach might differ from the Biden approach or what have you. I mean, one of the fascinating things about where we are now is, two major Trump officials have given speeches on this exact issue in the past couple months. And you almost have the converse issue where it's like, okay, all of a sudden we have attention on it from the top echelons of the Trump administration, but we have to make sure that it's not simply kind of folded into this larger US-China rivalry and just becomes one of the other issues that's kind of feeds into any type of hawkish or class of civilization narrative. Like, if you are a film professional, if you are a filmmaker, an artist, or creative, I think the first thing to do is make your is to lock in your framework for how you're going to approach this, which is this is an issue of artistic expression and how governments can influence, the creative storytelling rights of filmmakers.
James, I'm just going to jump in because we just got about 2 minutes left. I want to keep this on. Yeah, Chris.
And conclude.
What about you? Just for about a minute, what do you think people can do?
Look, I think you just keep talking about it. I mean, no longer a third rail issue. You talk about it around the water cooler and you talk about it on whatever your little social media community is. People will retweet it, they'll forward it, they'll share it. People will start to wake up to it. It's, look at how riled up people get over like gun rights or, individual mandates or whatever it is. I mean, here's a foreign country, the CCP, telling us what we can and can't say in our country. I mean, that's about as American as it gets. So the more people talk about it, the more people will know about it, and the more pressure will be put on the powers that be.
Thank you. Mega, last word to you. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say yeah, it's hard to say. Like, I would love to agree and say that, just greater awareness of the issue is going to create change, but that has not historically been true. But perhaps if there was kind of a seismic shift in the level that people care about this issue, then it would certainly make a difference. But I think fundamentally, consumer power is the thing that matters.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for this great discussion. And thank you to everyone in the audience. There's a lot of other great sessions and films. And at 6 p.m. tonight, there's a virtual happy hour with the staff of Double Exposure. Appreciate everyone's time. Have a good rest of your day. And thanks for listening. Take care.